Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 1 discussion. Today, we're going to be talking about the upcoming Legacy of Phrecia event, in which Grinding Gear Games are answering a number of what-if questions about Path of Exile. What if the 19 core Ascendancies were replaced by 19 new ones? What if the endgame Atlas progression system was replaced by something new? Now, I think that whilst the endgame Atlas progression system is something that's likely to be fun for a month, it's probably going to end up breaking really decisively. I think some of these Ascendancies are really good. This video, though, is going to be looking at the Surfcaster. Of all of the new Ascendancies, this is the one I'm most excited about. I think the Architect of Chaos is cool. I think the Gambler is really strong, but it's a Surfcaster that provides a perfect balance of damage, clear speed, and utility, all in one package, but mostly it's that clear speed is looking phenomenal here. On top of that, the Surfcaster has a couple of really weird things you can do, things that are really zany and crazy involving fishing rods. But one thing I really like about this Ascendancy is that it's really cohesive. It's not one of those Ascendancies where you're like, okay, there's one package of 6 nodes I could take, they're really good with each other, but there's nothing else that goes with them. Then there's another package of 4 nodes that looks really good, but then I'm scrambling to figure out what else I put everywhere else. Instead, no matter how you decide to build this, whether you play into the fishing memes or not, there is going to be a cohesive package of 8 points that you can take, and additionally, the 9th and 10th points you could have taken instead of your 7th and 8th, they're not going to be far behind. There's going to be a whole lot of potential to vary things around to decide, you know what, maybe I'd rather do this slightly differently, and then make a couple of little changes to the way the build is done. Now, I want to start though with the universally powerful sections of this, and let's start with Ghost of the Deep, shall we? Ghost of the Deep is going to be everyone's first 2 points. This is the most powerful thing you can do with your first Ascendancy, bar nothing, in Path of Exile at the moment. You are touched by a tormented illegal fisherman, granting the following benefits. 20% increased damage. This is neither here nor there. It's nice to have. It's not amazing because it's just increased. 30% increased attack speed. This would almost be worth an Ascendancy notable itself if you're playing an attack-based build. Not quite, but almost. 30% increased cast speed. Again, if you're playing a spellcaster, this is almost worth it. And 30% increased movement speed. The 30% increased movement speed on an Ascendancy notable is just unbelievably good. The old Raider was one of the best Ascendancies level 1 to 80 or so. Now the Raider's no longer in the game, but it was something that had a weaker version of Ghost of the Deep as the universal first 2 points that you took. It just granted you Onslaught. This is granting you Onslaught and a half, as well as that 20% increased damage as well. This thing is crazy. This thing is so good that, as I say, you take this as your first 2 points no matter what you're doing. Note that you still want movement speed on boots. There is a big difference between having 50% increased movement speed and having merely 30%. So you do want to have movement speed on boots. You still want to use a Quicksilver Flask, but this is going to be a second 3/4 strength Quicksilver Flask that's active all of the time, on top of everything else that it gives you. Absolutely fantastic 2-pointer. So good. I would use this if it didn't have the 20% increased damage. And not only would I use it, I would still rant and rave that it's the best thing in the Ascendancy, and it's one of the best things in the entire game. Add that 20%, that's just gravy. The next thing we want to look at is the things that are on the left-hand side. All of these are gated by Stormy Seas. Stormy Seas is quite transformative. Now, one of the things that the Surfcaster can do is it can mimic the effects of a lot of powerful unique rings. Here, we are mimicking the effect of the unique rings Call of the Brotherhood, and this is doing so on a bigger scale. 100% of your lightning damage is converted to cold damage. Your cold damage can shock. Now, if you are primarily a Path of Exile 2 player, it's important to note, damage conversion works totally different in Path of Exile 1. In Path of Exile 1, it is strictly better than it is in Path of Exile 2. The reason for this is that in Path of Exile 1, if you have damage that starts out as lightning and then converts into cold, your final damage will be scaled by both effects that scale your lightning damage and effects that scale your cold damage. So if you have one node on your Atlas passive tree that reads 40% increased cold damage, and another one that reads 40% increased lightning damage, and you have Stormy Seas and you deal base lightning damage, which then gets converted to cold, then you're going to benefit from both the 40% increase to lightning damage and the 40% increase to cold damage for a total of 80% increased damage that will apply to that particular source of damage that you're doing. So Stormy Seas is really good for those reasons. On top of that, your cold damage can shock means that you get the benefits of chill and freeze defensively, at the same time as getting the benefits of shock offensively. This is a big deal, and then on top of that, you also get the flags on the monsters that a target is shocked, is chilled, is frozen. Those are going to be active almost all the time, which is really important if you're using Herald of Ice, Herald of Thunder, and a whole bunch of other particular mechanics that trigger off whether a monster is frozen at the moment. If your base damage is originally lightning, then Replica Heatshiver will work quite well here because it'll all be converted into cold. The monster will have a fair chunk of shock effect on it because you're dealing cold damage that's capable of shocking, and as a result, you get a whole bunch of extra lightning damage added as extra cold. But also, you could use the OG Heatshiver, which adds cold damage as extra fire damage against frozen enemies. Both of these helmets are going to be quite strong on anyone that is playing a Surfcaster build, as long as you take Stormy Seas. And because Stormy Seas gates so much of the left side of the tree, I think the vast majority of people are going to take this. Now after that, we have two nodes that are utility related to ailments. We have Within the Tempest and Brine Bound. These are going to be at the weaker end of the nodes in this Ascendancy, but that doesn't mean they're useless. These are going to be things that by default you don't take, but that if your particular build needs them, then you definitely take them. Let's start with Within the Tempest. Enemies you kill are shocked. Now that doesn't seem very useful, but shocks you inflict spread to other enemies within 1.5 meters. Now this seems like it is designed in order to combo with Inpulsa's Broken Heart. This is going to be a rare and expensive item. It's always rare, it's tier 2 rarity in PathOfExile 1, which means that it's something that a casual player probably will not find drop in the entire event, and a veteran player might only get 2 or 3 of these dropping during the entire event, assuming that you play enough to reach level 97 or so. These items are quite rare. Now there are ways that you can min-max the amount of unique items that you get. If you do that, then you'll see more of these. The key thing though is that the most popular way to play PathOfExile 1 is in Trade League, and if you're playing in Trade League, whilst you might not get an Inpulsa's Broken Heart drop for yourself, you will get something else that someone wants. It might be that you get Unnatural Instinct. It might be that you get a particular Watcher's Eye. You're going to get something that other people want, and you will have some capacity to trade for an Impulse's Broken Heart that someone else has got. Now, this has a text, shocked enemies you kill explode, dealing 5% of their life as lightning damage, and this damage is unable to shock. Now, even though this lightning damage is going to be converted into cold damage, it still remembers that it's unable to shock, and so that's not going to have the explosive combinations you might be thinking of here with your cold damage can shock. However, it's still the case that Impulsa's Broken Heart is very, very strong at propagating kills through entire clusters of enemies, especially in conjunction with shocks you inflict spreading to other enemies within 1.5 meters. All you need is just some other source that's not Impulsa's Broken Heart, such as whatever spell you use to kill the first monster, and then you'll be able to get chain reaction pops going, and basically killing almost everything around you. Another thing that really works well with this setup that we'll get to later is going to be Herald of Ice and Herald of Thunder. However, you do need to be quite careful. The sorts of setups we're going to talk about later when we talk about Herald of Ice and Herald of Thunder, they're going to have a very real weakness. And that weakness is that they're going to be squishy. Impulsa's Broken Heart, unfortunately, for all that it is a fairly solid offensive and clear speed based piece of gear, it has very little defense on it. It has a couple of hundred evasion, 400, 500 at most. It has about 100 energy shield, and it has a sliver of life. This is not a defensive piece of gear at all, and as a result, you're going to be paying quite a high price defensively if you elect to go with the Impulsa setup. That said, the power is there. It is up to you. If you do elect to go down this route, I would advise you to consider having a Cast on Death portal setup. At least if you're running tier 17 content, you'll feel you need it. Related to that, we have Brine Bound. Now, Brine Bound is a very, very powerful ailment-related mechanic. 50% chance to freeze enemies for 1 second when they hit you, and enemies that you freeze remain frozen for at least 1 second. Everything on this is really powerful. This is defensive, but it's one of those things that is a conditional defense. It's only going to defend after you take a hit or after you're able to hit an enemy. Most importantly, it does not defend you at all from an opening salvo from an enemy. It is my general experience in PathOfExile 1 that the most of my deaths come from opening volleys. An enemy that I had not yet detected pops up and then does something particularly devastating, and I go splat. Brine Bound is not going to protect you from that, although it might potentially in some situations if you proc that 50% on the first of a pack of monsters that hit you, and then that freeze proliferates throughout the pack through one of the cluster duel mods that does exactly that. So Brinebound is something to at least consider there, but I feel like this is the weaker part of the Ascendancy. Where this Ascendancy is really going to shine is when we start looking in the bottom left corner at the things that are gated by our Stormy Seas. Now the mods that are on Glacial Wave may be familiar if you've ever equipped the unique ring Call of the Void. Enemies chilled by your hits lessen their damage dealt by half of chill effect. Enemies chilled by your hits have damage taken increased by the chill effect. So, if you are dealing 20% intensity chills on an enemy, this means those monsters, while they're suffering from that chill, they have 10% less damage that they deal to you, and they take 20% increased damage. This increase in damage is going to be in the same layer as shock. So if they have both a 20% effect from Glacial Wave, a 20% chill, and also a 24% shock on them, then that's 20% plus 24% is 44%. That counts as a 44% shock instead of the 24% shock and the 20% chill you have on that enemy. So there's a lot of power there in Glacial Wave. It's something that's a little bit less consistent because, again, it has that problem of not protecting you against first volleys, but I feel like this is more likely to be strong because it's going to be on enemies for a long period of time. So keep Glacial Wave in mind. It's a very strong effect there. And then we have Changing Seasons. All damage taken from hits can chill you. Now that sounds like it's terrible, but then the next line of text is there to the rescue. The effective chill on you is reversed. This is quite tricky to deal with. Now, the effective chill on you is reversed is one of those lines that it's really, really strong until you realize the most popular way of mitigating Ignite and of mitigating shock is to just become outright immune to elemental ailments full stop. If you are immune to elemental ailments full stop, even though chill is now beneficial to you, it's not going to be able to apply to you. So you need to manage to mitigate shock and ignite through some other means, and also freeze for that matter. So let's go through some of the options that you might use if you elect to go with Changing Seasons in order to get elemental ailment immunity that does not include chill. You're going to need to have some sort of solution to freeze. That's absolutely non-negotiable. And probably the lowest opportunity cost option here is to use the Pantheon Soul of the Brine King. Now, this has the text, at least for one of the upgrades, 100% chance to avoid being frozen. This is absolute protection from freeze. So that's probably going to be your solution there. Now, next up, you want to have some sort of solution to shock. Option 1 here is going to be also from the Pantheon, and that is to use Soul of Garakan. That's going to take the edge off shock. It doesn't make you immune, but it's 60% reduced effective shock on you. Once you've got that, you can then get more of that stat. It's available on rings. It's available in a couple of other spots. So that's an option that you've got to get rid of all chance to be shocked. And that's one way that you can consider. Another way is simply by using the unique chess piece Inpulsa's Broken Heart that we were talking about earlier. That's another way to deal with that. Now, when it comes to Ignite, Ignite can be a little bit trickier. Now, you can just endure Ignites unless you're doing Expedition content. Expedition and also Deep Delve are the two things that come to mind where you're definitely going to get killed by Ignites a lot if you're not outright immune to them. If you're going to just endure it, you've got the option of Soul of Abarath, 60% less duration of Ignite on you. That can be quite strong. There's also options to mitigate Ignite on Jewels, so that's something else that you could consider. There is also a Ring Val Implicit Corruption that you can get. It's quite rare, but that will grant you outright immunity to Ignite, so that's another option that you have. You probably want to find something for bleed, but you want to find a solution to bleed on any character anyway. There is another Implicit Corruption that's available on rings. That's one option there. Or you could go with Soul of Relicash, which can take a lot of the edge off of bleed. There's a bunch of options that you have. And something I would like to call to your attention as an option here as well. If you do decide to go down the route of enduring these ailments and potentially cleansing them with flasks, Lethe Shade is something you might consider. You're in the right area of the passive tree for it, and it causes ailments to have 100% more duration on you. Gee, that's really convenient, isn't it, when you want to be chilled? So keep Lethe Shade in mind. It does a lot of good things for you if you elect to go down this route with building your Surfcaster. So there's a lot of different ways that you can build around this left side of the ailment tree. As well as that, you're definitely taking Stormy Seas, even if you don't decide to take anything at Gates. And on top of that, you are definitely taking Ghost of the Deep, because Ghost of the Deep is crazy, crazy powerful. After that, however, we have the most build around me sections of this Ascendancy. We have firstly Sea Legs, then we have Screaming Reels and Bated Breath. Let's start with Sea Legs. This is something that's going to be really hard to figure out all of the ways to build around. Now, Sea Legs provides a couple of stats that are hard to get, but very powerful. what it means when it says critical strike chance is increased by overcapped lightning resistance. By default, your maximum lightning resistance is 75%. There's nothing stopping you from stacking 275% on your character. That 200% is wasted. Now, if you do raise your maximum lightning resistance up to 90, then it would only be 185% lightning resist that would be wasted there. All of this wasted lightning resistance is your overcapped lightning resistance. This then serves a different purpose. Instead of being wasted like it normally would be, it becomes critical strike chance. So again, to take the example, your maximum lightning resistance is 75, but you have 275 lightning resist on your character. In this situation, you've got 200% overcapped lightning resistance. You can think of this critical strike chance, 200% critical strike chance, as being the equivalent of having 4 additional power charges, just for the inherent benefits of power charges, which is 50% critical strike chance. That's something that's okay on its own, but the real power is in evasion rating is increased by overcapped cold resistance. You can overcap your cold resistance by a lot if you scale auras on your character, and then you were to go ahead and use Purity of Ice, and potentially on top of that also use Purity of Elements. These two together can get you a very large amount of cold resistance. On top of that, if you're wealthy enough to afford the unique belt Mageblood, then that in conjunction with the Sapphire Flask will send this stat up into the stratosphere. That ends up being a big global boost to your evasion rating. If you have 250% wasted cold resistance here, that becomes 250% increased character-wide evasion rating. This is not a more multiplier, it stacks additively with increased evasion rating that your character might have from the passive tree and from a few other sources, but it ends up being extremely, extremely strong, especially if you want to build some sort of weird armor stacker build that also takes iron reflexes. There's plenty of ways to build armor stacker builds. They're going to be something that will be explored for certain throughout this event. However, whilst it is usually armor that people stack in this way, you could also consider scaling evasion rating as well, and then using the original sword Green Feather. Lots of different things you can consider there. That's sea legs. Now we get to the weird stuff. What if I told you you couldn't use a proper weapon? All your weapon could give you was 50% more cast speed, and your hits always critically strike. I feel like for most builds, this is a wash, and certainly not worth spending 4 Ascendancy points to get. However, there are definitely exceptions. Firstly, we need to talk about fishing rods. Fishing rods are real items in PathOfExile 1. However, they're not something you're going to get in normal gameplay. They're something you can very deterministically farm if you have the right unique item. Enter Fairgraves' Tricorn. Fairgraves' Tricorn has a hidden modifier on it. So it does what it says it does on the item, adds cold damage to attacks, some evasion rating, some lightning resistance, you can't be shocked, and you can be affected by tormented spirits. However, on top of this, it has one more effect, and that is, while you've got this thing equipped, if you kill a unique monster, you have a percentage chance, probably between 0.5% and 1%, although this has never really been pegged down, to have a fishing rod drop. Fishing rods are among the worst weapons you can get in the game. Fishing rods do very little damage, they take up both hands, they can't even have the usual 6 sockets put in them, they're just generally quite a bit worse than a real weapon. However, they can gain cast speed as an explicit suffix, and of course that makes a bit of sense because cast speed makes sense both for spellcasters, but also for someone casting a fishing reel. It's worth noting as well that there is a very powerful but very, very rare unique fishing rod called Reefbane. Reefbane has the text 30 to 40% increased cast speed. This is higher than can roll on a rare fishing rod, and as a result, Reefbane is the strongest option that you've got that you can equip if you decide that you want to go down this fishing rod route. However, it's worth noting that Reefbane is the same rarity as Mageblood and Headhunter, and there's even some speculation that it might be rarer again, and whilst there are some more deterministic ways to try and target farm it, they all require starting with a Song of the Sirens and then applying an Ancient Orb to it. The problem is that Song of the Sirens can't drop from monsters that are level 99 and below, which is all the monsters in the game. The only ways that you can get your hands on a Song of the Sirens directly are from various divination cards, or potentially a very lucky drop from one particular map that happens to give you a random unique item when you complete it. And that is the Coward's Trial, which is not a common map, and getting Song of the Sirens from it is not common at all. But it does drop an item level 100 unique item, which is why you can get Song of the Sirens that way. And then once you've got that, you can apply an Ancient Orb to it and be guaranteed to get Reefbane. So, if you want to get Reefbane, That's not really any good way to do it. You can turn in a bunch of Jack-in-the-Box divination cards and hope for it, or alternately, you can try and scour Chance the Song of the Sirens, and then if you do get one, you can Ancient Orbit into Reefbane, but all of these ways are going to be painful. All of that said, getting a fishing rod is not so painful. All you need to do, equip Fairgraves' Tricorn, then kill as many unique monsters as you can, whether that be through stacking a whole bunch of Rogue Exiles onto your maps, or whether that be through doing the much more boring approach, going back to Act 8 and killing the Gemling Legionnaires over and over and over again until you're able to get a fishing rod to drop from them, because that's one of the most density of unique monsters that you can get in a deterministic spot in the game. These are the ways that you get them. You need to get a Fairgraves' Tricorn first in order to have any chance, and Fairgraves' Tricorn, this thing is pretty rare, but not staggeringly rare. So what I would suggest you do, set up your loot filter so that Fairgraves' Tricorn sings. If you get a Fairgraves' Tricorn, then you start considering maybe you want to go down the fishy route on your Surfcaster. Okay, so that's how you do it. What's the payoff? 50% more cast speed. This is really powerful. It's going to deal a lot more damage, but it's also going to drain your mana. However, it's worth saying that for most spells, this is worse than just having more gem levels. So for instance, if you were casting Fireball, I'm giving Fireball as an example, not because it's a good spell, you probably don't want to play it, but just because it's the first thing that comes to mind, going +4 gem levels on your weapon slots would actually provide more benefit than Screaming Reels would. And that's because it would give you more than 50% damage per cast, and whilst it would increase the mana cost of Fireball, it's not going to be by 50%. So you'd end up with more damage and less mana drain. Now, of course, there are a lot of benefits to having faster casts, even if you're getting less damage per second out of them. That means that you just play a more agile playstyle. You can squeeze out a spell, then move on quicker. And so there's a lot of benefits to that. But if you're just looking at it from a damage perspective, Screaming Reels alone is not enough to make up for the fact that you're giving up on using a real weapon. Not even when you factor in that you can get increased cast speed on the fishing rod, because your staff could also have increased cast speed, or potentially it could have critical strike modifiers on it, a whole bunch of other good stuff that you could get that you're not going to have on a fishing rod. Where this really shines is when you go for Bated Breath as well. Not just for Bated Breath on spells that already have a realistic chance to crit, but when you're wanting to do that combination and you don't have any realistic way of landing critical hits. Let's talk now about how I would go around building a character that is a Surfcaster using a fishing rod. Now, firstly, we're going to say that I have not yet solved defenses on this. This is going to be a squishy playstyle. However, not necessarily as bad as you might think, because we're going to be taking Stormy Seas, we're always critting, and what this means is that we're always inflicting freezes on our enemies. So every time that we hit an enemy, it's going to be frozen. But on top of that, because the Heralds we're going to be using, we're also going to be propagating big explosions where we're shocking and freezing enemies all around the screen, and that's going to be really useful to keeping us alive. So if a monster spawns behind us, chances are a Herald of Thunder is going to zap down pretty quickly on its head, and that Herald of Thunder, even if it doesn't deal enough damage to outright slay the monster, it will probably deal enough damage to freeze it and buy us a whole bunch of time. We're taking Stormy Seas, we're taking Ghost of the Deep because Ghost of the Deep is too good not to take, and then we're taking Screaming Reels and we're taking Bated Breath. Now, our primary skill is going to be something in Crest of Desire. Crest of Desire is a helmet that comes out of Heist. It's pretty rare, and as a result, this might end up being expensive if you want to get this going, but it has the advantage of tremendously scaling your damage whilst not scaling your mana cost too much, because I'm very conscious of that 50% more cast speed, meaning that you're otherwise going to be burning a lot of mana. You only get one socket, so no support gems available, plus 8 to the level of socketed gems. If you can afford a Crest of Desire, you can afford to divine it until you get to plus 8. And then socketed skills deal double damage. So whatever this skill happens to be, maybe you're doing Val Arc, maybe you're doing something different. It probably should be a base lightning skill, but potentially could even be a base cold skill. You're going to be doing tremendous damage from it, plus 8 levels, double damage, really, really good, especially when you're always critically hitting. How are we going to be scaling crit? Well, we're not. We've got 100% chance to critically hit already. We're not going to be investing in critical strike multiplier, except to use the gloves that overwrite our critical strike multiplier to exactly 300%. We're going to be using Malagaro's Virtuosity. These gloves have fallen out of favor completely over time in PathOfExile 1. They're not very good on most builds because normally you need to invest in both critical strike chance and critical strike multiplier, but with the Ascendancy providing all of your critical strike chance in one shot, there's no need to spec critical clusters, and most of the clusters that would provide critical strike chance will also provide some critical strike multiplier. They generally come in the same spots. For that reason, we're just going to go Malagaro's Virtuosity. It's not as much damage as you could get by speccing heavily into critical strike multiplier, but doing that is going to come at an unacceptable expense to the amount of other things that we can build into the build. After that, we're going to be wanting to use Herald of Ice and Herald of Thunder. What are we going to be socketing them in? Well, my first thought is a unique chess piece that doesn't really get that much love. Pragmatism. Pragmatism allows us to get a very, very easy level 29 Herald of Ice and Herald of Thunder. On top of that, these Herald of Ice and Herald of Thunder are always going to critically hit. Now, Herald of Thunder does not have the ability to shock. It does have the ability to freeze, but it does not have the ability to shock. But Herald of Ice in this build is capable of inflicting both freeze, which allows it to self-propagate, and also shock, which allows it to propagate the Herald of Thunder as well. So we end up with this propagation throughout screens that is really satisfying. It's almost like an auto bomber type setup, but at the same time, we do have a real skill for when we want to just deal heavier damage. And that real skill is always critting, always dealing 300% damage and double damage at the same time. And these are going to stack because double damage is not the same as critical damage. And so you're going to be able to multiply those things together. That's the start of a build that involves this setup. The problem from here is that I've got to solve defenses, and that's going to be the fun part. That's going to be something I will have to work on over a little bit of time. I'm quite excited by the potential of doing this though. I think there's a lot of potential here, but it is still not a completely finished package. We need to find a way to stay alive beyond just the freeze propagation that we're getting, even though the freeze propagation is actually a pretty solid defensive layer. Anyways, that is why I'm so excited by the Surfcaster. Haven't yet got a finished build, but I do think there'll be one that'll come out soon. It'll use some of these interactions we've talked about in this video, but I'm going to leave it there. May your Varlorbs have interesting results.